Auyuittuq National Park is slow to awake from winter's deep freeze. The locals are accustomed to these frigid temperatures. And the Inuit culture is woven into the fabric of this park. From remote corridors carved by elders in times long past, to modern twists on ancient traditions.
Inuit in these parks, they use the park. That's their land, that's their environment. And we have to remember that, Inuit are not visitors to these parks. They live here.
But for visitors to the park, one false step in this extreme environment, and there may be no redemption.
This is a wilderness park. It's very remote, and the dangers are quite real. River crossings, avalanche risk, rockfall, as well as polar bear and extreme weather conditions.
The best way of describing it is like walking in the lower jaw of a crocodile, so you got big teeth on each side.
The environment's in control, we're not. And as we travel through this, you realize that, and you realize it quickly.
Charles Miller and Aaron Doring are American professors on a mission. Their goal, to hike or pulk 100 kilometers through Auyuittuq National Park.
We are going through some really, really tough conditions, and in that sled, you have everything that you need to, sustain yourself for the days that you're going to be out.
These last few days have been probably the most difficult days of my life, but also some of the best.
For Miller and Doring, this journey is part of an international education project traveling to climate hotspots around the globe. Situated above the Arctic Circle in Canada's far north, they are all alone in one of the most isolated corners of the planet. 300 kilometers due north of Iqaluit, Auyuittuq encloses a massive expanse of rock, fjords, tundra, and ice. The distances here are grueling. The climate is punishing. But it's the price you pay for this view.
Auyuittuq in Inuktitut means the land that never melts, referring to the glaciers. And really that is the dramatic attraction of this park, glaciers and tall peaks.
Some of Auyuittuq's mightiest peaks are named in Inuktitut. Others are named after Norse gods. Loki, Asgard, Thor Peak. Towering 1,675 meters above frozen plains, Thor's cliff face is one of the sharpest sheer drops to be found on the planet. only the world's most elite climbers make attempts to scale its walls. One of the most stunning attributes of the park is Auyuittuq Pass. An ancient riverbed that stretches 100 kilometers through a shallow valley that divides the park's towering mountains. Inuit have used the corridor for centuries as a supply and trading route.
People used to hike through here to get bullets, tea, flour, and especially probably tobacco.
For Billy, this landscape is infused in his blood.
My grandfather used to work for a medical team, and he was their guide. He used to transport doctors or patients in and out to the hospital to Outpost Camp in Cumberland Sound. And this particular pass is named after him.
The ancient Inuit path is now a trail for Arctic adventurers. With nighttime temperatures hovering around minus 40 Celsius, it's a bone-chilling experience.
I think every morning when you look up at the mountains, you unzip your tent and you just see the mountains against hopefully a blue sky, and it's so clear. Yeah, it's cold, but you just learn to cope with the cold. It's just an incredibly beautiful place.
In the winter, most visitors trekking through Auyuittuq Pass choose to hike or ski. But there are other ways to cover the long distances. Dog teams can pull a sled loaded with supplies for 10 hours a day. They can cover more than 50 kilometers in a day's work.
In the whole park, you're basically walking or sledding down a big valley, a big fjord. Come on, guys. Yeah, you're a good boy. Oh, yeah, you're a good boy.
Louis-Philippe Potier runs an outfitting company based out of Iqaluit. With his dog team leading the way, he takes visitors on excursions through the park.
Most of the dogs we're using on Baffin Island are Canadian Eskimo dogs. So it's the exact same breed that Inuit peoples are using since years.
These days, Inuit use snowmobiles to travel through the park. Currently, only Inuit and Parks Canada employees are permitted to use motorized vehicles in the park. It's not the only exception that applies to Inuit communities. Inuit have retained the right to hunt within the park's boundaries. This is ancestral land where Inuit and their Thule ancestors have been hunting for centuries.
You know, this is my land, or that's your land, or somebody else's land. For Inuit, there's really no boundary for the lands. Inuit consider themselves, they're part of the environment.
Inuit peoples have a lot of traditional use of landscape, which is not typical of what we would think of in a national park.
Hi.
For Inuit living in communities near the park's boundaries, the landscape and its resources are intrinsically wound into their existence, past and present. But the polar bear hunt on Baffin Island remains a source of international controversy. Inuit hunters are limited by firm quotas. Many conservationists still worry that the polar bear is becoming an endangered species. The Inuit on Baffin Island argue that the polar bear population is healthier than ever. David Corneliusi has been monitoring the polar bear denning activity on the north coast of Auyuittuq for almost 30 years.
Anywhere you go, you see bears, way outside of the community. The number of polar bears are going up. It's not going down, it's going up.
When they were out in the outpost camp, they never used to see any polar bears. Now they see polar bears today. I mean, if the population was low, we wouldn't see all these young bears.
Despite arguments about the health of the polar bear population within the park, Inuit communities and Parks Canada agree on one thing. When polar bears enter Auyuittuq, they pose a grave threat to visitors in the park. Although wildlife groups claim otherwise, the polar bear population in Auyuittuq National Park seems to be on the increase.
Well, if we have to run into a bear, we definitely will observe it and report it to our head office and try to ward visitors of the presence of the bear. We're not overkilling the polar bears. There are more sightings of polar bears near our community, which we couldn't used to see. There's a lot of young bears. That means the population of bears are healthy.
We, as an Inuit, we look after our wildlife to make it sustainable, but our resources, such as polar bear, sea mammal, they're not threatened. They're very healthy.
Although Inuit are reporting more and more sightings of bears near their communities, some claim it does not necessarily mean there are more bears overall. Ecologists argue that more and more bears are being forced onto land because the sea ice around Baffin Island is melting faster than usual.
Our sea ice has a shorter season as it is already, and the sea ice is, for example, affecting when bears are on the ice and when they're off the ice.
One thing both sides agree on is that an accurate and updated census of the polar bear population needs to be undertaken. The last one in this region was conducted more than 15 years ago. In the meantime, scientists working in Auyuittuq National Park are keeping a close eye on how the ecological systems here are changing over time. Their greatest worries relate to one alarming trend. Temperatures in the park seem to be getting warmer and warmer, and it seems to be happening earlier in the season.
What we've noticed is that with warming temperatures, increased water flow coming off the ice cap, increasing water flow in the small streams coming off the ice cap, and increasing water levels in some of the lakes in the parks, which has resulted in some flooding and some severe flooding.
With time running out, Parks Canada is establishing multiple programs to monitor just how fast the melting is occurring in the region.
One of the big focuses has been glaciers and ice. So this is a way in which we hope to bring together both traditional Inuit knowledge and scientific knowledge.
This is going to become one station in a pan-Arctic set of stations to monitor the thickness of sea ice weekly.
At each monitoring station, holes are drilled into the sea ice in a grid formation. Copper wire is charged with an electric current and dropped through the ice. Heating the copper wire prevents the hole from freezing up during the measuring phase. Inuit return to the stations every week to remove the poles and note the depth and spread of the ice. The end goal is to acquire hard data on how the sea ice is changing over time.
Things are changing, and things are changing very quickly. And that's not only here in the national park, that's in all the regions of the Arctic that I have traveled.
I don't think everybody's quite got it yet. When we speak to the locals in this area, they tell us how much it's changed in the last 30 or 40 years, and it's quite spectacular, the change, and rather frightening.
Auyuittuq means the land that never melts in Inuktitut, the language of the Inuit. But the climate in this Canadian national park seems to be warming every year. The incremental change in temperatures is having a dramatic effect on the park's glaciers.
This particular glacier, within 10 years, if you're lucky, you'll see some part of it. It's because it's melting really fast with this rock showing, the sun, rain, a lot of contribution to shrink this glacier tongue.
Every year, spring comes a little earlier to Auyuittuq.
There'll be a rush of big river flashing right through right here, very fast, right to this lake. And this particular glacier, maybe in the long run, will probably disperse at one time.
Over thousands of years, hulking glaciers have inscribed the landscape of Auyuittuq. Glaciologist Christian Zdanowicz has been watching the glaciers of Auyuittuq with a close eye. Year after year, he returns to Auyuittuq to monitor changes in the retreating glaciers found within the park. With the ice core samples he collects, he can gain a glimpse into more than 5,000 years of ecological history.
The ice itself contains a record of past climate and atmospheric composition. A clear example is air bubbles trapped in ice cores. We've been able to extract air bubbles from and ice cores from the Antarctic, for instance, and look at how much CO2 was there in the atmosphere thousands of years ago and compare that to today's levels.
So this particular slice of ice is several thousand years old. So the air trapped in there was air from the atmosphere that was present in the polar atmosphere before the beginning of Christianity.
In glacial ice that formed in the last 50 years, Dr. Zdanowicz is now finding traces of mercury. The levels of the toxin are rising exponentially over time.
The sources that emit mercury into the atmosphere, the pollution sources, are largely in the south. So it can travel long distances in gaseous form, and it condenses, gets deposited in snow, and the snow eventually melts, the water enters the ocean, it goes into the food chain, and every time it goes up the ladder in the food chain, its concentration and toxicity increases.
Mercury poisoning is becoming a growing concern to the people living in the north. The toxin is now being discovered in mother's breast milk.
Wilderness and natural places are disappearing. We know that. They're disappearing worldwide. They're disappearing in Canada. And there's no question that losing those places would be losing a big part of ourselves.
In traveling all these places, probably over right around 4,000 miles by dog team, there's not a more beautiful place in the entire Arctic. I mean, just look around. There's just absolutely nothing that is more spectacular and that I've seen in the Arctic.
I've grown up here all my life. I've liked my scenery. I like mountains. I mean, not too many people get to see this kind of mountains that are unique and special. You know, the land's in love with me. I gotta take care of it.
Gordon Island is in flames. But this blaze is no accident. Parks Canada fire engineers are hoping the fire will regenerate the habitat. It's a question of what must be protected and what must be controlled. Located on the doorstep of several major urban centers, tiny St. Lawrence Islands National Park is in the middle of some of Canada's fastest urbanization. Thousands of vulnerable species use the park as a gateway during migration, and the wildlife of these gemstone islands exists within a precarious geography.
Ontario has 8 turtle species, and 7 of them are on the species at risk list. The park is lucky to have a lot of these turtles.
Maintaining a setting where it can survive demands constant vigilance. For more than a century, visitors have come to St. Lawrence Islands National Park to experience a northeastern wilderness, the way it used to be.
We've been on the river doing this kind of boating since 1989. But I've been on the river since the mid-50s as a tourist and fishing most of the time. It's the best.
It's the best.
There is no other part in the world like this.
The park and its scattered terrain is nestled within the Thousand Islands, 50 kilometers northeast of Kingston. With a wide variety of different habitats within its boundaries, it offers visitors a glimpse into one of the most biologically diverse landscapes in the country.
This is a real gathering of different ecosystems and different species, and turns out it's one of the most biologically rich parts of North America. And that presents some challenges because as islands are naturally fragmented, movement from the south up into the north is challenged by these barriers of water, by barriers of highways, by barriers of different land uses.
Thousands of creatures, big and small, migrate through these islands and mingle in the park's wetlands, groves, and forests. But this delicate and fragile landscape is located near a major urban corridor, and 3 major roadways run through the park. Highway 401 borders the park to the north. The Thousand Islands Parkway runs south of that, and the Thousand Islands Bridge connects those roads to Interstate 81 in the U.S. Over the last 400 years, traffic on land and water has become more and more brisk.
The St. Lawrence River does have a lot of heavy traffic that comes through the area, right from visitors and joyriders on their boats. There are also huge freighters coming through, bringing in goods from the oceans into the Great Lakes.
The St. Lawrence Seaway connects Canada's biggest interior ports to the rest of the world. And some of Canada's biggest cities are just a stone's throw from the park's borders. One of the greatest challenges caretakers of the park face is its proximity to such dense populations of people.
One of the visions that we go by in St. Lawrence Islands National Park is where land meets the water and people live. People are a part of this landscape. We've got this great aquatic and terrestrial confluence, and working that, how to maintain the ecological integrity of all that with folks is our challenge and our opportunity.
In 1904, 9 square kilometers was set aside by the Government of Canada as protected land. The park was the first of its kind east of the Rockies.
I'd say a rough average for visitation here is in the 45,000 to 50,000, and that's only during our operating season of 4 or 5 months. It's a lot of people in a small area, and it can have a profound impact on the resource.
The Wills family hike into this wilderness several times a year. But Julia, Matthew, Rachel, and Jenny are more than just visitors here.
What number is it?
2.
2? Got it.
Number 2, and it is 7.8 centimeters diameter.
Yep.
The park has called on private citizens to help them keep an eye on changes in the land.
Well, every year about the same time, in the fall, we go over to the forest plot and we have to take measurements of each of the trees in the survey. We assess it for its condition, whether it's alive or dead, whether it's doing well, whether it's under stress. And so it's just to give an idea over the years how the forest is developing. Sugar maple.
What kind of tree is it?
A white pine.
Good girl, yep.
The Wills are part of a monitoring program called the Citizen Science Initiative. They help to manage one of more than 100 similar plots of land in the region. The family collects regular observations on the animals and trees in their plot. And for Matthew and Julia, the experience helps them teach their children about the importance of the survival of wild spaces.
It's fun because we get to go and help and get to go and look at all the trees, and then we get to go play afterwards. Climb on all the fallen down ones. In the summer, everything's green. In the fall, everything's orange.
The Wills have been protecting this forest for 5 years. With 98% of neighboring land in private hands, this kind of cooperation is crucial for parks to keep track of the health of these ecosystems. But some caretakers of these forests are assigned more destructive tasks. In the spring of 2010, portions of St. Lawrence Island's National Park were ablaze. But this was no accident. Parks Canada started this inferno as part of their prescribed burn program. Decade after decade, forest fires were prevented within the park's boundaries. But park ecologists now realize that by suppressing fires, they were stopping many ecological cycles from running their natural course.
A lot of these islands and the Thousand Islands that we see around us right now, during prehistory, before there was a lot of settlement here, fires were a fairly frequent event. With the high trees would get struck by lightning, the soils would burn over.
With each prescribed burn, ecologists guide nature's hand, restarting the clock for various plant species indigenous to the park. Six months after prescribed burn here on Georgina Island, the torched land is beginning to show signs of life. Dale Christensen is a botanist at Queen's University. He manages a program dedicated to regenerating the deerberry populations in Canada.
We're very familiar with blueberries, but very few people are familiar with a very close relative known as the deerberry.
Deerberry has been listed as an at-risk species. It can be found in Canada in only 2 small geographic regions. One of them is here in the St. Lawrence Islands.
The roots probably go down about halfway.
Okay, that's good.
So we should be able to get them into this shallow soil without too much trouble. Okay. So really what we're looking at is a population or a species that is at the very limits of its range. It's up as far as north as it can possibly be, and that's why we're really dealing with such a small and threatened population.
Big saplings, like ochre maple that were 6 feet tall or so.
One of the things we want to do is establish good, secure populations of the deerberry that we're growing at Queen's University. So we grow them in the greenhouse there and move them out here in the spring and put them into areas of slope and soil depths and shade that we think that they will thrive in.
As plant life on tiny Georgina Island regenerates, some of the usuals will be able to move back into the neighborhood. At first glance, the creatures that linger on these islands seem to be at leisure. traveling by land, by air, and by water. Many of them are actually on the move.
The Algonquin to Adirondack corridor is basically a really narrow area of wilderness that's connecting two really large wilderness areas in Adirondack State Park in New York and up to the Algonquin Park and sort of northern Ontario. And there's this little link that goes right through the Thousand Islands. It's fairly narrow, but it's a relatively wild area. And it's important as a corridor for species to move. There's evidence, research has shown that moose, lynx, and fishers are moving through this area, and they kind of use the islands as stepping stones. It's rather than crossing large Lake Ontario or the St. Lawrence once it widens, in the Thousand Islands they can just cross a short body of water, either in the winter over the ice or by swimming across, and get from one island, a short crossing, to another island, so they use stepping stones to get right across the river.
One species that makes regular stops through the St. Lawrence Islands is the black rat snake. Gabrielle Blouin-de-Mer is a professor at the University of Ottawa who studies the snakes.
One peculiar thing about rat snakes is that they're really good tree climbers, so they spend about 30% of their time up in trees. And that allows them to feed on bird eggs and nestling, although the major item in their diet are small mammals. So anything up to chipmunks all the way down to deer mice.
Black rat snakes are the largest snake in Canada. They can be up to 2 meters long. Some can live to 20 years. But like many other species in the park, black rat snakes are increasingly threatened by industrialization in the region.
It's a fairly large snake, so if you're coming around a corner and there's a snake on the road, they're really hard to avoid. And we've documented that road mortality is a serious issue for rat snakes. And obviously habitat loss is an issue as all listed species. So as more and more habitat is converted to suburban developments, that's obviously not very good for rat snakes. So what we've been doing in collaboration with Parks Canada is establishing monitoring programs to basically follow the status of the population. We capture animals at hibernation sites every spring. They're marked animals, so based on the number of new individuals versus recaptures, we can estimate population size through time and see whether the populations are going up or down.
With 20 years of research under his belt, Dr. Blouin-de-Mer can see a distinct trend. Populations of black rat snakes are in decline.
The main hypothesis to explain this decline is road mortality, and we've done some demographic modeling that suggests that the killing of a few adults on the road each year is sufficient to take a stable population and make it decline.
While the black rat snake is hanging on, trying to maintain its foothold on land, park ecologists are also focusing their attentions on creatures that ply the waters of the park. And making sure they're doing all right is top priority.
The aquatic environment is really important to this park. Without the river quality, without the wetlands and the aquatic ecosystems, the Thousand Islands really isn't intact. You can't have one without the other.
The wetlands of St. Lawrence Islands National Park teem with underwater life.
One of the things that makes St. Lawrence Islands National Park so special and so unique is its really high species diversity. And the reason why we have such high diversity is we have a whole bunch of different ecosystems and habitat types mixed into this small area. So you get all these different sort of ecozones mixed in here that a whole wide variety of species use.
The wetlands in particular are a haven for spawning fish. They are an essential breeding ground for marine life in a time when natural habitats are deteriorating fast.
We've lost, I think, over 75% of our wetlands in southern Ontario, so a lot of wetland species are declining, even still to this day. Wetland birds, turtles, so that's the focus of my research.
Pauline Quinnell studies wetlands as a graduate student at Carleton University.
Come on, turtles. Where are you? There we go. I'm looking at turtles and wetland birds, and I'm looking at how our land uses affect those wildlife. And so what I mean by that is how the adjacent land uses surrounding wetlands and their habitats affect the abundance and distribution of wetland species. So does it matter how much road is in the area, how much agriculture or development? Do they need a really natural landscape to be able to persist?
Pauline's research is revealing that the endangered wetland species thrive in locations that are distant from roads, agricultural, and developed areas. The data that's collected in the park is also being used to make future projections for areas that haven't been visited by researchers. The goal is to ensure that the fragmented landscape remains a corridor for the animals that must travel across it.
Turtles, for example, don't stay in one place, they move across the landscape. So the park and ecologists in general are interested in looking to make it easier for these species to move across the landscape.
Some of Canada's great aviators are regular visitors to these reeds and cattails.
Let's skirt the edge to start. Might sink it up.
Oh yeah, jeez.
So ecologists here are also keeping a close eye on the skies.
This kind of wetland, you'll find lots of great blue herons. You'll see lots of red-winged blackbirds, song sparrows, Virginia rails. But it's not really easy to find these birds. And so what we do is we broadcast their call. Every bird has a unique call or song that you can identify. And so we broadcast their song into the marsh, and if they're there, they'll respond. They really are responsive to broadcasts of their calls.
When the birds respond, their numbers are counted and recorded at about 60 sites throughout the park. So far, the occurrence rate has been very successful, with birds responding at 35 to 40% of those sites. Pauline's research will be used to figure out how much natural habitat each species needs to withstand development.
I'm hoping that by understanding how the surrounding land use can affect wildlife, I hope that it will provide information to guide us on how to better plan our land use for the future so that we can keep these animals a part of our landscape.
Tucked within such a densely populated area, many of the species that depend on the St. Lawrence Islands are feeling the squeeze. As development in the region accelerates, the black rat snake is finding itself enclosed within a tightening network of roads and highways. Songbirds are running out of wetlands in which they can nest. And Ontario's greatest freshwater fish and turtles are losing their traditional spawning grounds.
Some days you feel like crying when you see all the development and you know the species are getting killed or bumped back there. But then, there's those days where you really accomplish something. This is a gorgeous area. There's still lots of ecological integrity. Species diversity is really high, and as long as the park's able to keep working with conservation partners and working with regional residents, there's no reason to think that we can't keep this natural ecosystem intact.
Programs in place like the Citizen Science Initiative and Fire Regeneration are renaturalizing St. Lawrence Island's National Park. The park has more forest cover than it did a century ago. And recently, St. Lawrence Island's National Park more than doubled its size. It's a huge step forward, providing greater sanctuary to all the creatures that come to dwell on these tiny gemstone islands.